The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of wood settling in the night. It was the kind of silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind, amplifying every little thought I tried to suppress. I sat slouched on the worn leather couch, a half-empty bottle of beer dangling loosely from my hand. The muted glow of the TV flickered across the room, some late-night infomercial droning on in the background. But I wasn't paying attention. My focus was elsewhere, on her. Marissa, my wife of 12 years, had texted earlier, a curt message that was becoming all too familiar. Working late again. Don't wait up. That made it the third time this week. At first, I didn't question it. She had a demanding job at a marketing firm, and tight deadlines weren't unusual. But lately, those late nights had started piling up, and with them, a mounting pile of unanswered questions. Why the sudden wardrobe upgrades? Who was she always texting when she thought I wasn't looking? And why did she seem so guarded whenever her phone was in her hands? I took another swig of my beer and rubbed my temple, trying to shake the growing knot of unease. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining things that weren't there. But doubt, I'd come to learn, was like a splinter. Once it's under your skin, it doesn't stop burrowing until it's too deep to ignore. At my feet, Rex, our golden retriever, stretched lazily before resting his head on his paws. He was watching me in that way only dogs can, head tilted slightly, his soulful brown eyes filled with quiet concern. Rex had been my best friend since we adopted him 5 years ago. Loyal, gentle, and always attuned to the moods of the household, he was the one constant in a world that felt increasingly out of sync. You sense it too, don't you, buddy? I muttered, scratching behind his ears. Rex huffed in response, his tail giving a half-hearted wag before he nestled closer. The sound of the garage door jolted me from my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Marissa's heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor as she entered, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I'm home," she called out, her tone brighter than the hour warranted. Rex's reaction was immediate. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Startled, I looked down at him. Rex was normally ecstatic when Marissa came home, bounding toward her like she was his favorite person in the world. Tonight, though, he didn't move. His growl deepened as Marissa stepped into the living room, her bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. "What's wrong with him?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation as she stopped in her tracks. "He's never acted like this before." I frowned, studying Rex's tense posture. "I don't know," I said slowly. "He's never done this." Marissa set her bag down, crouching to Rex's level with an exaggerated smile. "Come on, boy. What's the matter?" "It's just me." Rex didn't budge. If anything, his growl grew louder, his tail stiff and unyielding. It was an unsettling sight. Rex loved her, or at least he used to. Marissa stood abruptly, brushing off her skirt with a forced laugh. "He's probably just tired. Dogs have moods too, right?" I didn't answer, and she didn't wait for me to. With a flippant, "I'm exhausted," she headed upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a very agitated dog. As her footsteps faded, Rex relaxed slightly, the tension leaving his body like a deflating balloon. I stared after her, my mind racing. Rex never growled at anyone, let alone Marissa. Dogs were intuitive, weren't they? They could sense things people couldn't. Could Rex be picking up on something about her that I wasn't? The next morning, I woke to the sound of the shower running. Marissa had left a note on the counter. "Early meeting downtown. See you tonight." I stared at the note for a long moment, feeling the now familiar pang of suspicion. Shrugging it off, I grabbed Rex's leash and decided to take him for a walk. As we passed the window, Rex froze, his ears perking up. I followed his gaze and saw a sleek black car idling across the street. The driver, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair, leaned casually against the hood, scrolling through his phone. I'd never seen him before, and something about his presence felt out of place. Rex let out a sharp bark, startling me. The man glanced toward the house before quickly getting back in his car and driving off. I watched him go, my unease deepening. Later that evening, Marissa came home with her usual. Work was exhausting. Routine, but Rex's reaction was the same. His growl was louder this time, his posture more defensive. Marissa scolded him, claiming he must be sick or losing it, but I knew better. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was more than just late nights at work, or moods. Rex wasn't just being weird. He was warning me. I stared at the ceiling, a plan forming in the back of my mind. If Marissa was hiding something, I was going to find out. And Rex, my loyal companion, would be the key. The next morning, I woke up to a sense of resolve I hadn't felt in weeks. The lingering doubt and tension that had taken up permanent residence in my chest now had a focus, a direction. If Marissa was hiding something, and I was almost certain she was, I needed proof. And Rex, my loyal companion, would help me get it. I brewed a pot of coffee, the hum of the machine filling the silence of the house. Rex sat by my feet, his head tilted slightly as he watched me with those ever-curious eyes. It was strange how much comfort I found in his presence, more than I found in Marissa's these days. That realization hit me harder than I expected. "All right, buddy," I said, setting my mug down and crouching to his level. "We're going to figure this out. But first, you've got to learn a few new tricks." Rex wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out in an expression of blissful ignorance. He had no idea what I was asking of him, but his loyalty shone through in every movement. That day marked the beginning of Rex's training. He already knew the basics: sit, stay, roll over, but this was different. I needed him to respond to more subtle cues, to focus on specific people, and most importantly, to communicate when he sensed something was wrong. I started small, using treats to teach him to bark on command and stop when I gave a signal. He was a quick learner, his tail wagging eagerly after each successful attempt. By the end of the week, Rex could differentiate between objects and people I pointed to, reacting only when I told him to. I tested him with neighbors and delivery workers, instructing him to bark only if I gave a subtle hand signal. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I'd never trained a dog like this before, but desperation was a powerful motivator. Marissa, for her part, seemed oblivious to the new routine. She spent her days at work and her evenings either glued to her phone or locked in her office under the guise of catching up on emails. I didn't press her for details yet. I was still collecting my own evidence, piecing together a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. The black car returned on the third day of training. This time, it parked a little farther down the street, but the driver didn't get out. I noticed it from the living room window, my stomach knotting as I peeked through the blinds. Rex stood by my side, his ears twitching. "See that?" I whispered to him, pointing toward the car. Rex followed my gaze, his body tensing. "That's who we're looking for." I grabbed a treat and held it just above his nose, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "When you see him, you let me know, okay?" Rex barked once, his tail wagging in anticipation of the reward. I scratched behind his ears and handed him the treat. "Good boy." Marissa came home late that night, looking disheveled but trying to pass it off as exhaustion. She barely acknowledged me as she dropped her bag on the counter and rummaged through the fridge for a bottle of wine. Rex was waiting for her by the door, his posture stiff. "Oh, not this again," she groaned as Rex let out a low growl. "What's his problem? Has he lost his mind?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe he's just picking up on something." She shot me a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine and disappeared upstairs, muttering about a long day. As I watched her retreat, Rex padded over to me, his tail still and his ears alert. "She's hiding something," I muttered, scratching his head. "And we're going to find out what." The next morning, I installed a camera in the living room, hidden among the books on the shelf. I felt a pang of guilt as I adjusted the angle, but the need for answers outweighed my discomfort. If Marissa was doing what I suspected, I needed proof, not just for my peace of mind but for whatever came next. Over the following days, Rex's training intensified. I started using recordings of different voices, friends, neighbors, even strangers from YouTube, to test his reactions. Then, I introduced Marissa's voice into the mix. I played a clip of her talking, followed by the sound of another man's voice, one I didn't recognize but had overheard during one of her late-night phone calls. Rex's reaction was immediate. He growled, his ears flattening against his head. "Good boy," I said softly, my chest tightening. I rewarded him with another treat, though the bitter taste of betrayal lingered in my mouth. By the end of the week, I felt more prepared. Rex was attuned to my signals, and the camera had already captured several suspicious moments. Marissa whispering urgently into her phone, slipping out late at night, and once, a quick kiss blown toward the camera before leaving the house. That footage stung more than I cared to admit. Then came the weekend. Marissa announced she'd invited a few friends over for drinks, a casual gathering, she said, to unwind. I didn't believe her for a second, but I kept my mouth shut, my mind working overtime. This could be it, the moment Rex and I had been training for. I made a show of playing the supportive husband, offering to set up the patio and grill. As the guests began to arrive, Rex sat by my side, his posture alert. I placed a hand on his head, steadying both him and myself. Tonight I'd find out the truth. And with Rex as my partner, I wasn't going into this battle alone. By the time Saturday evening rolled around, our house was unrecognizable. Marissa had spent the day transforming it into a social oasis, complete with mood lighting, expensive wine, and a charcuterie board that looked too perfect to eat. She flitted about the house in a tight black dress, her phone clutched in her hand as she coordinated last-minute details. She barely spared me a glance as I worked quietly in the background, setting up the grill and placing chairs on the patio. "Make sure Rex stays outside," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing as the dog followed her every movement. "He's been acting weird, and I don't want him freaking anyone out." I bit back the urge to snap at her. Instead, I leaned down and ruffled Rex's fur. "Don't worry, boy," I murmured. "We've got this." The first guests began to arrive just after 7. They were mostly Marissa's friends from work, people I barely knew and cared even less about. They waltzed in with bottles of wine and fake smiles, offering polite greetings before disappearing into the kitchen. I played the role of the doting husband, shaking hands and making small talk, all while keeping a watchful eye on Rex. He stayed close to my side, his tail wagging faintly whenever someone acknowledged him. But his ears remained perked, his gaze darting around the room like he was on high alert. Then, at 7:42 p.m., it happened. The black car pulled up outside. I noticed it from the kitchen window as I refilled the ice bucket. My pulse quickened as the driver stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. I recognized him instantly. He was the same man who had parked down the street earlier that week. He walked with an air of confidence, carrying a bottle of wine in one hand and a gift bag in the other. "Here we go," I whispered under my breath. Rex growled softly as the man approached the front door. His entire body tensed, his hackles rising as though he could sense the tension radiating from me. I knelt down, gripping his collar as I gave him a quiet command. "Wait." When Marissa opened the door, her reaction was subtle but telling. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months, her lips curling into a smile that was far too warm for a casual work acquaintance. The man greeted her with a hug that lingered just a moment too long, his hand resting on her lower back. My jaw tightened as I watched them exchange pleasantries, their voices blending with the chatter of the other guests. "Who's that?" I asked casually as Marissa walked past me, leading the man into the living room. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh, that's Evan. He's one of our new clients. I invited him to network a bit." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed another beer and joined the group on the patio, my mind racing. "Evan," I repeated silently, filing the name away for later. I'd find out exactly who he was soon enough. As the night wore on, I kept a close eye on Marissa and Evan. They didn't stay glued to each other, but there was an unmistakable familiarity in the way they interacted. She laughed at his jokes, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. He leaned in when he spoke to her, his body language radiating confidence and ease. It was subtle, the kind of behavior most people wouldn't think twice about. But I wasn't most people, not anymore. I'd spent weeks scrutinizing every detail, and I knew what I was looking for. Rex, meanwhile, stayed on edge. He stuck close to me, his gaze flicking between Marissa and Evan. When Evan stepped out onto the patio to mingle, Rex let out a low, rumbling growl that I quickly stifled with a firm command. "Sorry about that," I said, forcing a laugh as Evan glanced down at the dog. "He's usually friendly, but he's been acting up lately." Evan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No worries. Dogs can be funny like that." Funny, I thought bitterly, watching as Rex bared his teeth ever so slightly. "He doesn't like you, and neither do I." Around 10 p.m., the party began to wind down. Guests trickled out one by one, offering hugs and goodbyes as they headed home. Evan lingered, helping Marissa clear dishes and pack up leftovers. I stayed in the background, my irritation simmering just beneath the surface. When he finally left, Marissa walked him to the door, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I couldn't hear what she said, but the way he smiled in response made my stomach turn. As soon as the door closed, Rex let out a sharp bark, breaking the tense silence. "What's gotten into you?" Marissa snapped, glaring at the dog. "You've been acting crazy all night." "He's just tired," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "We all are." Marissa rolled her eyes and disappeared upstairs without another word. I stayed behind, leaning against the counter as Rex sat by my feet. My hand trembled slightly as I patted his head. "We're getting close, buddy," I muttered. "We're going to figure this out." Later that night, I reviewed the footage from the living room camera. The clips confirmed what I already knew: Marissa and Evan were more than just colleagues. The way she looked at him, the way she touched his arm, it was all there, plain as day. But it wasn't enough. I needed something definitive, something she couldn't deny. I shut the laptop, my resolve hardening. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and soon, I'd have everything I needed. For now, though, I needed patience. Rex and I would wait, watch, and prepare. The truth was out there, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter what. The following days felt like a slow-motion spiral. Every glance, every word Marissa spoke, felt laced with something I couldn't yet name. At first I thought it was guilt, but now I suspected it was something closer to arrogance. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, not from me, not from Rex. Rex was becoming sharper by the day, almost like he could feel the tension coursing through me. He had grown more attuned to Marissa's movements. When she left the house, he stationed himself at the front window, watching until her car disappeared down the street. His reactions became more pronounced each time Evan's name popped up on her phone, which was happening more often than she likely realized. The notifications on her phone became a symphony of subtle betrayals, quick dings during dinner, whispered calls she took in the other room, and messages that made her smile in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. But I didn't ask her about them. Not yet. One Thursday evening, I got the break I'd been waiting for. Marissa had left for a supposed team meeting at a restaurant downtown. I knew better than to believe it. I sat in the living room with Rex by my side, the soft glow of my laptop illuminating the stack of papers in front of me. Over the past few days, I'd started digging into Evan's background. If I was going to confront Marissa, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Evan Barrett, divorced, early 40s, works in marketing consulting. His firm had been one of Marissa's key clients for the past 6 months. No kids, but he seemed to have a taste for expensive cars, upscale dinners, and women like my wife. The camera footage from the weekend party still played in my head like a bad movie. The way she leaned into him when she laughed, the subtle touches that weren't so subtle to someone paying attention, it was all there. My hands clenched into fists at the memory, but I forced myself to focus. The next piece of the puzzle was already in motion. At 9:15 p.m., Rex's ears perked up. He trotted to the front door, his nose pressed to the crack at the bottom. A car engine purred faintly from outside. I walked over and peeked through the blinds. There it was, Evan's black car parked across the street. My stomach churned. This wasn't coincidence. He'd never parked directly outside our house before. "Stay," I whispered to Rex, grabbing my jacket and slipping out the back door. The night air was crisp, the faint scent of rain lingering on the breeze. I circled the house, keeping low as I approached the street. Evan hadn't noticed me yet. His attention was fixed on his phone. He seemed relaxed, his posture almost smug as he leaned against the car. I crouched behind a row of hedges, my heart pounding as I pulled out my phone and started recording. After a few minutes, Evan made a call. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I caught enough to confirm what I already suspected. "Yeah, I'm nearby. She said she'd call once the meeting's over. Maybe we grab a drink after?" He laughed, the sound grating in my ears. "Don't worry, she's not suspicious. He's clueless." Clueless. The word echoed in my mind, and my grip on the phone tightened. Clueless? He had no idea how wrong he was. Rex barked suddenly, shattering the quiet. Evan's head snapped up, his gaze darting toward the house. I ducked lower, holding my breath as he scanned the street. After a few tense moments, he got back into his car and drove off. When I returned to the house, Rex was waiting at the door, his tail wagging as if he knew what I'd done. I crouched down and scratched his head. "Good boy," I murmured. "We're getting closer." The next morning, Marissa was in an unusually good mood. She hummed to herself as she made coffee, her phone sitting on the counter within arm's reach. Rex sat near her, his eyes fixed on the device like he was waiting for something to happen. "You're in a good mood," I said casually, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She shrugged, flashing me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The team's finally making progress. It's a relief, you know?" I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But my mind was already working, piecing together the next steps. That evening, I installed a second camera in the kitchen, strategically hidden among the shelves. It was becoming clear that the living room camera wasn't enough. Marissa's activities were spreading throughout the house, and I needed to capture everything. By the time she left for another meeting that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger and frustration that had been simmering for weeks were now focused, channeled into a clear goal. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was preparing for the confrontation. As Rex and I settled into our routine, I found myself talking to him more openly. "You've got my back, don't you?" I asked, running a hand through his fur. "We're going to figure this out, no matter what." Rex tilted his head, his tail thumping softly against the floor. His unwavering loyalty was the one thing keeping me grounded in the chaos. The camera footage from that night would prove to be the most damning yet. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. The web of lies was still unraveling, and I needed to see how deep it went before I made my move. And so I waited. The storm broke on a quiet Tuesday evening. Marissa had spent the day working from home, her laptop perched on the kitchen table as she typed furiously between phone calls. I pretended to be absorbed in work emails, sitting in the living room with Rex at my feet, but every click of her keyboard felt like a ticking clock. Rex had been restless all day, pacing between me and the kitchen. He never growled or barked, just watched her, his golden eyes narrowing every time she stood to refill her coffee or check her phone. It was as if he could feel the tension radiating off me, his quiet vigilance mirroring my own. By 6 p.m., Marissa closed her laptop with a satisfied sigh. "I'm going out tonight," she announced, not even glancing in my direction. I looked up, feigning mild interest. "Another late meeting?" She hesitated, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "No, just dinner with some friends from work. I won't be out late." "Friends?" I almost laughed out loud. But instead, I nodded and leaned back on the couch, masking my suspicion with a casual shrug. "Have fun." Marissa disappeared upstairs to change, and I waited until I heard the click of the bathroom door before I moved. Quietly, I retrieved her purse from the counter, my pulse racing as I rifled through it. Her phone wasn't there. She never left it unattended, but I found something else. A receipt, crumpled at the bottom of her bag. It was for a restaurant downtown. The date was 2 weeks ago, and the total was well over $200. Dinner for two, easily. I stared at the receipt, the weight of it settling in my chest. She hadn't mentioned going out that night, and I knew she hadn't gone with me. My hands clenched around the paper, the urge to confront her surging through me like a tidal wave. But no. Not yet. By the time Marissa came back downstairs, dressed in a sleek navy blouse and black heels, I'd put the receipt back and composed myself. "You look nice," I said, forcing a smile. She offered a perfunctory, "Thanks," before grabbing her keys and heading for the door. Rex barked once, sharply, as it closed behind her. I waited a few minutes before springing into action. Grabbing my laptop, I opened the feed from the cameras I'd installed. The kitchen camera showed her pacing earlier that day, phone pressed to her ear. I turned up the volume, straining to catch snippets of her conversation. "Just need to be careful. He's been asking questions." My heart pounded as I skipped to another timestamp. "No, he has no idea. Trust me, he's clueless." Clueless. There was that word again, like a taunt aimed directly at me. The final clip sealed it. The camera in the living room caught her leaning against the counter, her back to the lens. She was typing furiously on her phone, and while I couldn't see the screen, the soft laugh that escaped her lips was enough to make my stomach churn. I slammed the laptop shut, leaning back in my chair as the weight of it all bore down on me. She was hiding something, no, everything, and now I had proof. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Rex padded over to me, his warm eyes meeting mine as he rested his head on my knee. "We're close, boy," I muttered, running a hand through his fur. "Just a little longer." When Marissa returned later that night, Rex greeted her with a low growl. She recoiled, shooting me an exasperated look. "Seriously? What is his problem?" I shrugged, keeping my tone neutral. "Maybe he's picking up on something." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she marched upstairs, slamming the door behind her. That night, as I lay awake, I couldn't stop replaying the day's events in my mind. The receipt, the camera footage, her dismissive attitude, it all pointed to one conclusion. She was lying to me, and I needed to catch her in the act. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The next morning, Marissa announced she was taking the day off to run errands. I pretended to believe her, nodding absently as she left the house. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed Rex's leash and my phone. "Come on, buddy," I said, leading him outside. "Time to go to work." We trailed her discreetly, staying a safe distance behind as she drove into town. Rex sat in the back seat, his nose pressed to the window as if he knew this wasn't a normal walk. Marissa pulled into a parking lot outside an upscale cafe, stepping out of the car in a bright sundress I hadn't seen before. She scanned the area briefly before walking inside. I parked a block away and waited, my stomach twisting in knots. 10 minutes later, Evan arrived. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I watched him stride confidently into the cafe. He was dressed casually, his sunglasses perched on his head as he greeted Marissa with a kiss on the cheek. That was it. The confirmation I didn't want but knew was coming. Rex let out a soft whine from the back seat, and I turned to him, my jaw tightening. "Not yet," I said, my voice low. "We'll get them, but not like this." I pulled out my phone, snapping pictures of them through the cafe window. Marissa was laughing at something Evan said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight made my stomach turn, but I kept my focus. This wasn't just about catching her anymore. This was about making sure she couldn't talk her way out of it. For the rest of the day, my mind raced, jumping between anger, disbelief, and cold calculation. The image of Marissa and Evan at the cafe was burned into my memory, replaying every time I closed my eyes. Her laughter, her hand on his arm, she wasn't just lying to me. She was living an entirely separate life right in front of my face. But now I had proof. The photos on my phone, paired with the receipts, the camera footage, and Rex's uncanny instincts, painted a damning picture. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was reality. And it was time to do something about it. That evening, Marissa came home as if nothing had happened. She breezed through the door, kicking off her heels and dropping her purse on the counter. "Long day," she said, flashing me a smile that made my skin crawl. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. "Busy?" "Yeah," she replied, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Errands took longer than I thought." Rex growled softly from his spot near the couch, and Marissa shot him a glare. "Seriously, what's wrong with him lately?" I shrugged, masking the satisfaction I felt. "He's been protective. Maybe he senses something." She rolled her eyes and disappeared upstairs. I waited until I heard the water running in the shower before pulling out my phone. The photos of her and Evan stared back at me, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. It wasn't enough to confront her, not yet. I needed to think bigger, to make her face the consequences in a way she couldn't escape. That's when an idea began to form, a plan so unorthodox that it almost made me laugh. "Rex," I murmured, crouching down beside him. He looked up at me, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "We're going to teach her a lesson she'll never forget." The next morning, I got to work. Over the past few weeks, I'd been refining Rex's training, teaching him to respond to subtle cues and specific people. Now, it was time to put those skills to the test. I started by reinforcing his reaction to Evan's scent. I still had the wine bottle Evan had brought to the party, tucked away in a cabinet where Marissa wouldn't notice. I let Rex sniff it, giving him a treat every time he growled. "Good boy," I said, patting his head. "That's exactly what I need you to do." The next step was more complicated. I wanted Rex to bark and growl whenever Evan came near the house, but only on my command. It took hours of practice and more treats than I'd anticipated, but Rex was a quick learner. By the end of the day, he was responding perfectly to my signals. I couldn't help but smile as I watched him. "You're going to be a hero, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. Marissa had no idea what I was planning. Over the next few days, she continued her routine of late nights and vague excuses, completely unaware that I was watching her every move. Each time she left the house, I checked the cameras and tracked her location through the GPS app I'd installed on her car weeks ago. It was almost too easy. She was so wrapped up in her affair that she didn't notice the cracks forming beneath her carefully constructed lies. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. Marissa announced she was hosting a small family gathering that weekend, something she insisted on to keep up appearances. She made a show of inviting my parents and her sister, but I knew the real reason behind the event. Evan would be there. She didn't say his name, of course, but I could tell from the way she avoided my gaze when she mentioned a friend from work. It was the perfect setup. The day of the party arrived, and Marissa was in full hostess mode, arranging flowers and preparing hors d'oeuvres like our marriage was picture perfect. I played along, helping set up the backyard while keeping one eye on Rex. By the time the guests started arriving, Rex was already on high alert. He sat by my side, his ears twitching as he watched the flurry of activity. Then, at exactly 6:30 p.m., Evan walked through the front door. Rex's reaction was immediate. He growled low in his throat, his body tense as he stared at Evan. I gave him a subtle signal, and he barked sharply, his hackles rising. "Whoa," Evan said, stopping in his tracks. "What's with the dog?" Marissa laughed nervously, shooting me a look. "He's been acting strange lately. Ignore him." But Rex didn't stop. He barked again, louder this time, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Marissa's parents exchanged confused glances, while my mother raised an eyebrow. "Rex, quiet!" Marissa snapped, her voice tinged with panic. I crossed my arms, feigning confusion. "That's odd. He only acts like this when he senses something off." Evan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Marissa forced a laugh, trying to deflect. "He's just being protective. Let's head to the patio." But Rex wasn't done. As Evan stepped farther into the house, Rex lunged forward, barking furiously. The sudden outburst startled everyone, and Evan froze. "What the hell is going on?" Marissa's sister asked, her eyes narrowing. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Dogs are intuitive. Maybe he doesn't like something about Evan." The tension in the room was palpable. Marissa looked like she was about to explode, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides. "I think you should leave," I said calmly, turning to Evan. His face darkened, but he didn't argue. He muttered something under his breath and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Marissa turned to me, her eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell was that about?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached down and patted Rex's head, my smile growing as I met her gaze. "Just wait," I said softly. "This is only the beginning." The tension in the house was suffocating after Evan stormed out. Marissa stood frozen by the door, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked as though she was caught between chasing after him and lashing out at me. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched into the kitchen, her heels clicking angrily against the tile. I followed her, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Rex trailed behind me, his tail stiff as he kept his watchful eyes on Marissa. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, whirling around to face me as soon as we were out of earshot of the guests. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms as I studied her. "You tell me," I said, my voice calm but laced with steel. She scoffed, throwing her hands up. "You humiliated me. You embarrassed my guest in front of everyone." "Your guest?" I raised an eyebrow, letting the word hang in the air. "Marissa, I think we both know he's a little more than that." Her face flushed, and for the first time in months, I saw real panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. "I know, Marissa," I said, my voice cutting through her defenses like a knife. "I know about the late nights. I know about the cafe, the texts, the receipts. I know about Evan." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, she looked like a cornered animal. But then she straightened her spine, her expression hardening. "You don't know anything," she said, her tone cold and dismissive. "You're just paranoid." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. "Paranoid? Is that what you're calling it?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the gallery to the photos of her and Evan at the cafe. I held it out to her, watching as her bravado crumbled. Her face drained of color as she stared at the screen, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the phone. How did you?" "I've been watching, Marissa," I said, my voice low and steady. "I've been watching for weeks. And do you know what I've seen? You. Lying. Sneaking around. Treating me like a fool while you carried on with him." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like, I swear." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by lying to my face. I have the receipts, the photos, the footage. Rex has been growling at him for weeks, and now I know why. He senses what I've been trying to deny. You've been cheating." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless. I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "So let's hear it. How long has it been going on? Weeks? Months? Or has it been since the day you met him?" Marissa's jaw tightened, and she finally mustered the courage to speak. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "It started a few months ago. I was stressed, and you were always so busy. I felt... I don't know. I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I repeated, my anger flaring. "You felt invisible, so your solution was to jump into bed with someone else? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't plan this," she cried, tears streaming down her face now. "I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed again, the sound bitter and cold. "Hurt me? You didn't want to hurt me, but you spent months sneaking around with another man. Do you even hear yourself?" The kitchen fell silent, the only sound the faint murmur of voices from the backyard. I could feel the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating me. "I don't even recognize you anymore," I said finally, my voice breaking. "You're not the woman I married." Marissa wiped her tears with a shaky hand, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "A terrible mistake. But we can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through it." "Stop," I said, cutting her off again. "Just stop. You don't get to decide how this ends. Not after what you've done." She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, we can." "No, Marissa," I said firmly. "I'm done. You've been lying to me for months, and I can't trust you anymore. This marriage is over." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse. But then she straightened, her expression hardening once again. "You think you're so perfect," she spat. "Like you haven't made mistakes. Maybe if you weren't so focused on work all the time, I wouldn't have needed someone else." I shook my head, her words barely registering. "Keep telling yourself that if it helps you sleep at night. But we both know the truth. You destroyed this marriage, not me." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, Rex following close behind. As I stepped onto the patio, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Behind me, I could hear Marissa's muffled sobs, but I didn't turn around. I was done looking back. The morning after the confrontation, the house was eerily quiet. Marissa had spent the night in the guest room, slamming the door behind her after our argument in the kitchen. I hadn't slept. Instead, I'd lain awake with Rex stretched out at my feet, staring at the ceiling and replaying the night's events in my head. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't stay in this house any longer, not with her lies clinging to every corner. It was time to start putting my life back together, brick by brick, without her. I walked downstairs, greeted by the smell of stale coffee. Marissa was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her phone in one hand and a mug in the other. She looked up when I entered, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. I ignored her, heading to the fridge to grab a bottle of water. Rex followed me, his nose brushing against my leg. "Do you hear me?" Marissa asked, her tone sharper this time. "We need to figure out what's next." I turned to her, leaning against the counter as I crossed my arms. "What's next is that I'm calling a lawyer." Her expression crumbled, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But then I remembered the way she'd smiled at Evan, the lies she told me night after night, and the guilt evaporated. "You're really going to throw everything away?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I shook my head, my voice cold. "I'm not throwing anything away. You already did that." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "I'm leaving, Marissa. And you need to decide whether you're going to cooperate, or make this harder on both of us." Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't want a messy divorce," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "Noted," I said, grabbing my keys off the counter. "I'll be back later to get my things." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I met with a lawyer that afternoon, a sharp woman named Lisa who didn't mince words. I laid everything out for her, the affair, the evidence, the state of my marriage, and watched as she jotted down notes with a calm, calculating expression. "You have a strong case," she said when I finished. "The photos, the receipts, the footage, this will hold up in court if it comes to that." I nodded, though the thought of dragging this mess through the legal system made my stomach turn. "I just want to move on," I said quietly. Lisa gave me a sympathetic smile. "I understand. Let's start with a formal separation agreement and go from there. I'll handle the paperwork." When I returned home that evening, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Marissa was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't acknowledge me as I walked past her, heading upstairs to pack my things. It took less than an hour to gather what I needed: clothes, toiletries, a few sentimental items I couldn't bear to leave behind. Rex watched me from the doorway, his tail wagging faintly every time I looked his way. "You're coming with me, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. By the time I finished packing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed Rex's leash and headed downstairs, bracing myself for whatever Marissa might say. She looked up as I entered the living room, her eyes red and puffy. "You're really leaving?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I am." She didn't try to stop me this time. Instead, she just sat there, silent and defeated, as I walked out the door with Rex by my side. Rex and I settled into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a temporary solution until I figured out my next steps, but it was mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. The first night in the apartment, I sat on the floor with Rex, a cold beer in one hand and his favorite toy in the other. He wagged his tail enthusiastically as I tossed the toy across the room, bounding after it with a sense of joy I hadn't felt in months. "Good boy," I murmured, watching as he brought the toy back to me. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Rex barked in response, his eyes shining with unwavering loyalty. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, took Rex on long walks through the park, and even started reconnecting with old friends I hadn't seen in years. The pain of Marissa's betrayal lingered, but it didn't define me. One afternoon, as I was sorting through paperwork for the separation agreement, I received an email from Lisa. Attached was a preliminary draft of the documents, along with a note. "Based on what we discussed, this agreement ensures you retain the house and a fair share of the assets. Let me know if you'd like to make any changes." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was it, the beginning of the end. I glanced down at Rex, who was sprawled out on the floor beside me, his tail wagging lazily as he chewed on a bone. "We're almost there, boy," I said softly. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control. 2 months had passed since I walked out of the house with Rex by my side. Life in the small apartment was simple, even lonely at times, but it was honest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living a lie. Rex had adjusted quickly, finding comfort in the daily walks, the extra attention, and the growing routine we shared. As for me, I was healing, slowly but surely. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. Marissa was still a presence in my life, even if only through paperwork and the occasional text. Most of her messages were transactional, updates about splitting the accounts, questions about dividing furniture, and one brief, half-hearted apology for everything that happened. I never responded. What was there to say? That changed on a cloudy Friday afternoon. I was at the park with Rex, watching him chase a tennis ball across the grass, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The message was from Marissa. "We need to talk. Can you come by the house this evening? It's important." My first instinct was to ignore it. What could she possibly have to say that I hadn't already heard? But curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was another excuse. Either way, I decided to face it head-on. The house looked the same as the day I left it, though it felt oddly foreign as I pulled into the driveway. Marissa opened the door before I even knocked, her expression a mix of nerves and determination. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't reply, walking past her into the living room. Rex followed at my heels, his presence grounding me. The air inside felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Marissa sat down on the couch, gesturing for me to do the same. I stayed standing. "What's this about?" I asked, crossing my arms. She hesitated, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I wanted to talk about us." "About what happened?" "There is no us," I said flatly. "Not anymore." Her face crumpled, but I didn't let myself feel sympathy. I'd spent too many nights grieving over what she'd destroyed to offer her any comfort now. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice trembling. "And I know you probably hate me." "I don't hate you," I interrupted. But I can't forgive you either. She looked down, her shoulders slumping. I made a mistake, she whispered. A terrible mistake. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I shook my head, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something you didn't mean. You didn't make a mistake, Marissa. You made a choice. Over and over again. She winced, but I pressed on. You lied to me. You betrayed me. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed our marriage, our trust, everything we built together. And for what? Some guy who doesn't even have the guts to stick around when things get tough? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. I've spent the last 2 months picking up the pieces of my life while you, what? Moved on? Played the victim? What do you want from me, Marissa? Forgiveness? Closure? Because you're not getting it. The room fell silent, my words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Marissa wiped her eyes, her breath hitching as she struggled to compose herself. I didn't ask you here to beg for forgiveness, she said finally. I wanted you to know that I've ended things with Evan. He's gone. For good. I let out a humorless laugh. And that's supposed to make me feel better? Like that erases what you did? No, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But it's the truth. I've been going to therapy, trying to figure out why I did what I did. And I realized I was running away, from my own insecurities, from my fear of being alone. But it wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth losing you. I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. You already lost me, Marissa, I said quietly. Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. The wounds she'd left were still too fresh. Is that all? I asked, my voice cold. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. I needed you to know. Fine, I said, turning toward the door. Now you know where I stand, too. Rex followed me as I walked out, his tail brushing against my leg. I didn't look back. That night, as I sat on the couch in my apartment, I felt lighter somehow. Not happy, there was no happiness in what had happened, but free. Marissa's words hadn't changed anything, but they'd reinforced what I already knew. I'd made the right decision to leave. Rex curled up beside me, his warm body pressed against my side. I ran a hand through his fur, grateful for his unwavering loyalty. We're better off, aren't we, boy? I murmured. He wagged his tail in response, and for the first time in months, I let myself smile. The seasons had changed by the time the divorce was finalized. The leaves that once clung to the trees outside my apartment were now scattered across the sidewalks, rustling underfoot as Rex and I took our evening walks. The air was crisp, a hint of winter biting at my cheeks, but it felt refreshing, like a clean slate. The paperwork arrived in a plain manila envelope, delivered to my lawyer's office and forwarded to me. It was official, the marriage was over. 12 years reduced to a few signatures and stamped documents. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope lying unopened in front of me for several minutes. When I finally opened it, the sight of the papers didn't bring the sadness I expected. Instead, I felt relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I was free, not just from Marissa's betrayal but from the lies I'd unknowingly lived with for months. Rex lay sprawled on the floor beside me, his ears twitching as I scratched behind them absent-mindedly. That's it, buddy, I said, my voice steady. We're officially moving on. He wagged his tail in response, his tongue lolling out in a goofy grin. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life that Marissa had left shattered. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, uninvited and unwelcome. But I'd learned to embrace the silence, to find comfort in the routines I was creating for myself. Work became a welcome distraction, a steady anchor in the sea of change. My colleagues noticed the difference in me, how I was more focused, more determined. Even my boss commented on how I seemed reinvigorated. Whatever you're doing, keep it up, he said with a grin one afternoon. I nodded, smiling back. Little did he know that the changes weren't just about work. They were about me rediscovering who I was, separate from the man I'd been in my marriage. Rex played a huge role in that transformation. His boundless energy and unrelenting enthusiasm forced me to get out of bed on days when I wanted nothing more than to stay under the covers. Our walks became longer, our adventures more frequent. We explored new trails, met other dog owners at the park, and even joined a local hiking group. One Saturday morning, as we were climbing a steep hill with the group, a woman fell into step beside me. She was petite, with auburn hair tied back in a messy ponytail and a Labrador retriever trotting beside her. "Your dog's got great energy," she said, nodding toward Rex. I smiled, glancing down at him. He was bounding ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at everything in sight. "Yeah, he keeps me on my toes. I'm Emily, by the way," she said, extending a hand. "And this is Daisy." "Nice to meet you," I replied, shaking her hand. "I'm Mark, and that's Rex." For the rest of the hike, we walked together, chatting easily about everything from our dogs to our favorite hiking spots. It was the first time in a long time that I felt genuinely at ease with someone. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I started seeing more of each other, first at group hikes, then at the dog park, and eventually over coffee. She was kind and funny, with an easygoing warmth that made me forget the bitterness I'd carried for so long. One afternoon, as we sat on a bench watching Rex and Daisy chase each other, she turned to me with a curious expression. "You don't talk much about your past," she said gently. "Is that on purpose?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the leash in my hands. "It's not an easy story," I admitted. Emily nodded, her eyes understanding. "I get it. Whenever you're ready, I'm here." Her patience was disarming, and over time, I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't expected. I told her about Marissa, about the betrayal, about how Rex had been my rock through it all. She listened without judgment, her quiet presence reassuring me that it was okay to let someone in again. Months turned into a year, and life began to take on a new shape. The wounds Marissa had left weren't gone, but they had faded into scars, reminders of a chapter one had closed for good. Emily and I grew closer, though I was careful not to rush things. For the first time in my adult life, I was learning to build a relationship on a foundation of trust and honesty. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As for Rex, he seemed to thrive in this new phase of our lives. His joy was infectious, his loyalty unwavering. He adored Emily, and the feeling was mutual. Watching them together made me realize just how far I'd come from the man I'd been when this journey started. One evening, as we sat on the couch in my apartment, Emily leaned her head against my shoulder. Rex was sprawled out on the floor in front of us, snoring softly. "You're different than when I first met you," she said, her voice soft. "How so?" I asked, tilting my head to look at her. "You're lighter," she said simply. "Happier." I thought about that for a moment, a small smile tugging at my lips. "That's because I finally feel like myself again," I said. She smiled, reaching for my hand. "Well, I like this version of you." As I looked at her, at Rex, at the life I'd built from the wreckage of my past, I realized she was right. I was lighter. I was happier. And for the first time in years, I was truly free.